Thank everybody. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. It's good also to be in the cooler of the rooms here at Kramerbooks. I was a little scared when I first walked in. I was like, I survived Afghanistan only to die at Kramerbooks. No, it's really great to be here, and it's great to see you guys here. And it's nice to see that people are interested in this subject because when back in 2001. This seemed to be invading Afghanistan seemed to be the obvious thing to do, and that the approval rating for the invasion was in the 90s in October of 2001, and now it's down to the teens. So obviously things have changed, and often when Americans tire of a war, they don't want to hear about it anymore, and they just want to move on. So it's kind of nice to see that that has not really been the case here, at least as far as I can tell from the reception to this book. There seems to be a lot of interest in this tale, which is really a story of a micro view of American interventionism. America's been invading foreign countries pretty much since the very beginning. There's rarely been even a few months in our history when we weren't invading or occupying some other country. And this Afghanistan is our longest in our war, our longest occupation, and in fact, it's no end in sight. We have a defensive troop authorization agreement in place until the year 2024. And yesterday, President Obama announced that U.S. troops will remain in Afghanistan, kind of more or less indefinitely. But when I wrote this book in 2010. I started it when I went on the trip that is the centerpiece of the book in 2010. It was in response to Obama's announcement that that the U.S. would withdraw, and so this is a look at the war from the end of the beginning of the war in December 2001 to the beginning of the end in 2010. Because even though we are still going to have troops there, mentally and emotionally, the United States has, as they say here in the capital, pivoted away from Afghanistan. And so even though the troops are still there and they're fighting and killing and dying, we are still, the mood of the country has moved to other things, other priorities, like another war, like a war in Syria. So this was an attempt to look at the way at the war through the lens of the Afghan people. I mean, this has been marketed from the very beginning as a war since 9/11 for hearts and minds in the Muslim world. And so I was frustrated, like many Americans, by how the U.S. media was so focused on the troops and their experience. And you can't really cover a war without looking at the troops, but you can't really cover a war without looking at the civilians. And that's what pretty much the news media has been doing since 2001. And there's good reasons for that, like it's dangerous and it's expensive and news media has been melting down financially. And there's bad reasons for it, which is that it's hard work, it's dangerous, and there's a lot of cowardice and not that much interest. And it's a lot more fun to drive around in an APC than it is to eat Afghan mystery meats. So with that, I think I want to introduce Cal, who is my colleague who I've known for about 20 years, I would say. At that time, he was the cartoonist for the Baltimore Sun, and he was the president of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists and hosting the convention in Baltimore, and that's when we met in 1995. So we've both been fellow political cartoonists all these years, and the profession has changed a lot. And Cal, has always had that spot at The Economist, but he's been very, like me, has had to adapt and change to passing times. And we both have our most recent books were funded, at least in part, through Kickstarter. So which is a reflection of the way that the media has changed. And so Cal's going to ask me some questions.
I'm going to definitely. I'm definitely going to ask him some questions.
And then we'll throw it out to you guys.
Sure. So just as a little background, probably many of you in the room here have never met a cartoonist. Okay, there's only about 100, well, maybe under 100 editorial cartoonists practicing in the country today. And they're just like comedians, and there's all different kinds and styles of comedians. There is that same with cartoonists, all different styles and approaches. And already, I think what you've gleaned from hearing Ted talk for the opening moments here is what an amazing journalist he is. People often think of cartoonists as a bunch of yucksters who are putting out jokes all the time, but at the soul of it is journalism, and Ted is one of the best examples of it. Because what you fail to mention, I'm just going to talk about his book for a second, is that this book has got writing, which you're a very capable writer, cartoons, and you are actually an embedded cartoonist. You were actually filing as a cartoonist while in Afghanistan. This does not normally happen. So tell us a little bit about, first about the trip, and then, being a cartoonist like this on a trip, being a cartoon journalist.
So cartoon journalism is journalism using cartoons instead of words. So that's simple. Joe Sacco is maybe the most famous recent example of this, but there are a lot of others. Guy Delisle does it. He's a Quebecois cartoonist, great, did a book called Pyongyang, highly recommend it. So I've been doing this since the mid-90s when I first heard about the genre through Joe Sacco's work. And I sort of realized pretty quickly that it allows you to see things that the camera can't see and that words can't depict. It's sort of the in-between zone. Scott McCloud, who's a theorist about cartooning, wrote a book called Understanding Comics. And in that book, he talks about how comics are unique in that they allow you to project yourself into the character on the page in a way that other media don't. I mean, if you think about it, if you go see a movie, you probably aren't thinking like, I'm Clint Eastwood or I'm Meryl Streep, right? You're just like, that's their experience. It's hard to identify with their experience. You might empathize with it, but that's not your experience. And if you read prose that's very specific, even if you understand the voice of the author, it's not the same as being able to put yourself into it, even if they're a very gifted writer. But with cartooning, as McCloud said, even in a really especially with a very abstract drawing style, and a great example of this would be Peanuts or The Simpsons. People are able to psychologically project themselves onto that blank canvas and imagine themselves in the situation. And so probably my first successful book of graphic journalism was based on the first trip that's in this book and that book came out in 2002. It's called To Afghanistan and Back. What happened at that time, so it's pertinent to this book, is I went to cover the war for the Village Voice and a radio station in LA. And I had no intention of writing a book or anything or doing any kind of comics or anything. Frankly, it was a way to make a lot of money by doing something daring and also seeing Afghanistan at the same time, which I'd always wanted to see. So it's a little bit of war tourism. But I got myself into a little more than I expected. So the convoy of journalists that I was in, we were 45 from all over the world, including some Americans, suffered the most casualties of any convoy in the history of war correspondency. And so we lost 3 colleagues, and then 8 were very seriously wounded. And it was 3.5 weeks of just carnage and chaos, and we all came out of it just wrecked. And so I came back, and I just couldn't do anything. I mean, I was still filing my cartoons, of course, but I was like, didn't want to go out. I didn't want to talk to anybody. And my publisher was worried about me because I owed him a book about something else. And he's like, what's going on with you? And I told him, and he's like, you should really write a book about this. We need, everyone wants to know what it's like in Afghanistan. They don't care about the politics. They want to know what it's like because the coverage is so frustrating. You can't see, how. So go. So I banged out this sort of instant book that became the first book of any, really in any form, about the 2001 war. And therefore it did really well because there was a huge, appetite for that knowledge. And looking back at it, I like the book because it does give you that sense of like you can almost taste the grit of Afghanistan in your teeth when you read it. And I think people, who've never been there, can get that. But it was a little rough around the edges because it was done so fast.